Okay, let's take a look at 1776. This is sort of the avowed classic for the Revolutionary War. Obviously, there are some people who prefer something like Washington's War with the People, with the card-driven flavors in a more modern design style. But, for the more traditional war game, this is the one that most people know and love. For me, I got it fairly early, not when came out, but fairly early in my wargaming career, late 70s, whatever. And I was really excited about it. At that point in time in my life, Revolutionary War was something I loved a great deal. My first, maybe military-themed game was the old Milton Bradley Skirmish, which I've already covered. And is a fun little game that actually handles some things better than this does, actually, but largely it's just not a simulation at all. I put it close to the same realm as Washington's War, to tell you the truth. Not to dismiss Washington's War entirely, but I don't believe that it does a very good job of simulating either the military or political side of things, although it may be a fun game. So, for whatever reason, though, excited or not, this never really hit on all cylinders for me. And I'm not quite sure the why of it. Some of it, there's some very interesting concepts in here, and we'll get to them in the rules, but for the strategic campaign game, how troops are generated. I have some theories as to what may have been difficult for me to embrace this game. One is, it's actually hard to grasp what you need to do. And I'm not saying that I grasp it now, but I'm looking at the rules with an older set of eyes and saying, I think that's what's going on here, at least in part. Another is the visual, the graphic of it. I don't find this an attractive board, especially with these separate hard pieces that kind of, but that's Avalon Hill still. I also find the counter somewhat less appealing than, say, similar counters that came out in a slightly later game, which I did take a lot of pleasure out of for a while. I'm looking for it. It's got to be here somewhere. Oh, there it is. War and Peace. Very faded box. Been facing the sun too long. Oh, guess that's going to happen to a lot of my games, huh? Combination of the graphical style, some of the detail. That game has more detail, more politics going on in an overt sort of way. It's also less reliant on these cards, which kind of irritated me since I only played this solitaire. This game also had some kind of painful little rules. The representation of the waterways, the navies. It's not presented in the easiest to digest manner for me. What's kind of astounding about this game, though, is its age. It came right after sort of the flat box classics, and in terms of its era, and that shows. That shows with the TEC over here. That shows with the hard cards. Although Avalon Hill continued with those. It shows with the style of the rules, which, strangely enough, because of that era, and because whatever innovations Don Greenwood put in place that started making Avalon Hill rules worse and worse, it's not the ultimate. These are not what I would see as an ideal set of rules by any means. However, they're much better formatted than what Avalon Hill started coming up with later. In terms of approachability. But I found them difficult. I actually find probably the War and Peace is probably the best era. There was some tinkering going on there with the old Charles Roberts style of rules. There's some here. I found that to be a somewhat more pleasing rule book. Maybe because it doesn't have glossy paper. These little things really affect my desires and taste in a game. Anyhow, I want to give it another shot. One of my digs against it had always been, you know, how can you really do the Revolutionary War without leaders? Leadership is such an important facet in it. Well, I managed to find online what I guess is the leader rules that were printed in the General, and I made some of my own beautiful counters, which are, not going to enhance my enjoyment of the experience, but honestly, the counters that Avalon Hill presented originally, much in the keeping with the game style, were not exactly terribly attractive. So I'll be adding that into it. Partway through, I ran across the 1775 campaign and said, oh, I want to do that. Well, it turns out that requires the 3rd edition rules. Those are available online, but they require even more counters and some significant changes that I'm just not in the mood to face. This is sort of a filler for me. I have another game that I'm clipping and prepping that I want to get to the table, and another one coming in the mail that maybe requires less effort that I want to get to the table. So this is kind of a, hey, I'm putting this up because it has, I thought it was the most approachable of the really high-rated games for my situation right now. So, we'll give it a shot. I'm actually kind of debating, geez, do I even want to play with these leader roles? But I know that one of my big criticisms is going to be the original didn't have leaders. But having read these, they do add a little bit of complexity to it that I'm not sure I like. Okay. There are some other things, and the designer is very honest about, the things he left out in the whys. So, for example, he left out or specifically avoided trying to define a major victory for the colonials a la Saratoga in order to keep the game simpler. Because although he recognizes that, that is really the key event towards bringing the French into the war, and instead goes with kind of a time-based event with a die roll. I don't like that, and I suspect the 3rd edition rules probably change that as well. The truth of the matter is, at the time this game came out, it was stretching the bounds of the complexity of an acceptable game. Yes, you have Third Reich and Squad Leader and stuff like that, but this was still in that heavier zone, much more than the classics were, and I think those design decisions were made because it wasn't really understood how much the market was willing to bear in terms of complexity. I suspect that 3rd edition rules is heading closer to, what the hobby was like when I got into it a couple years later, when you were seeing more and more complex rule sets hitting the table. But be that as it may, I didn't feel like tackling and printing out. It's a much larger rule book for no great reason, except maybe the typeface is larger or something. I don't know. This is pretty big. This gets by on like 20 pages, so that's impressive. So let's take a look at what we have. First of all, we have the East Coast, where most of the fighting's going to happen. In fact, it's very unlikely you go very deep onto this board in most places. Various types of terrain, your mountains, most of it's just normal terrain. Rivers are handled in some depth. You have Class 1, Class 2, and then I think Class 3 is these yellow bordered ones. And then you have coastal hexsides, which also are... the actual units are very, very abstracted. That allows the designer to avoid, having to account for units temporarily disbanding and coming back and stuff like that, and just repositioning and having to worry about all kind of stuff like that really would have interfered with the design if you were tracking individual units in some cases. Although there are some complex things like these bateaux or bad twats. I wasn't always able to pronounce things properly. I was never able to pronounce things properly, including now. They kind of extend the difficulty level of the game already, and those are optional rules. You have your French, you have your basically each side has two types of units. So the blue units are the Continental Army, the green are the Rebel Militia, the chartreuse units are the British regulars, and the orange are going to be the Tory militia. But also there are orange Injuns there, so basically all your regulars. You have a set of cards. These are going to be tactical cards for the battles, and they work for, if I can find it, using this tactical results matrix, which basically just gives you a modifier in the battle. War and Peace is very derived from this game in a lot of ways, and it includes a chit pull or a chit selection mechanism that's very similar to this as an option. And the optional combat rules to that are actually pretty intensive, more so than the combat rules here. All right, before I dive into the rules, I'm going to have to do a battery swap and probably take a break. But the core rules of this don't have anything terribly shocking in them. It's an I go, you go type of game. You move, paying the movement point costs for crossing terrain. Terrain is all on the hex sides, so the rivers are on the hex sides. In terms of that side of things seem pretty much your standard war game. There is the facet that you get this big stack here of multiple colors. You have to actually enter the hex to fight something. That's a little bit away from what most games in the era had, but I don't think it's terribly shocking there. The counters are just strength points, so they can be broken down and consolidated as you wish. Now, the basic game, which ends on page 6 of the rules, uses a different combat results table, straight odds based, eliminated. This is standard, Avalon Hill Classics, basically. No retreats, no, nothing like that. Maybe a little different. I don't recognize those charts as well as some of you might. I don't think many people would play the basic game. I feel like that's just a translation of let's get a scenario. It's only a single scenario, first of all. And I don't know what it's meant to teach you, except that you fight in the same hex. Away from the standard AH classics. There really isn't much there. So let's look at the advanced games rules. And there's a little bit of difference here. They add some additional units. We had these scenario cards indicating different historical campaigns that were in play. Combat's a little different. So instead of using the basic combat table, you use the advanced combat table, which adds another column. It adds some results. Instead of just eliminations, it has these lose X, which you end up losing that many strength points to indicate a very closely fought engagement if it's a larger force. If it's smaller forces, those can be pretty impressive losses, actually. But it also adds the idea of these cards. Now, each player, at the beginning of each round of combat, slaps one of these down, keeping the others hidden, as his tactic for the battle. They get flipped over, and largely they get compared in an attacker to defender comparison. So, if I enfilade right and you refuse the right, well, you get a bonus. But if you refuse the left, oh, I chose right. And it becomes just really a huge game of rock, paper, scissors for that. There are some exceptions, though. NC says there's no combat, and I believe there will be no further combat in the battle at all. I'm not positive of that, because I don't see that here. may just cancel out the round of battle. These red ones, on the other hand, allow for one round of combat. Well, obviously, if both sides are withdrawing, they're out of there. So I think these do end the battle, even if both sides are just standing and defending. But these red ones indicate that you've gotten sort of a successful pursuit in place for the guy who's withdrawing. You're going to get one more round of combat on the table. Now, in order to engage in combat, you have to have you should have supply. If you're not supplied, your units are halved in effectiveness. And first the attacker, then the defender decides whether they're expending supply. Expending is kind of a weird situation. I believe you have to have it stacked with you? Yeah. You have to have one of these little supply units stacked with you, in general, to fight. And those can freely each supply and support one round of combat. But if you use any supply marker for more than a single round of combat, it'll be expended at the end of the combat. So it can supply the forces indefinitely through as many rounds as you like, but it's used up. You have magazines, which are similar to supply units, but they extend to 2 hex radius, and they can supply as many battles as you like without being expended. They're immobile, though, so they're a problem. And basically, you convert 2 supply units into a magazine. And you can also break them down into a pair of supply units if you so wish. If you end up with 6-to-1 odds or greater in general, when you move into an enemy-occupied hex, you can eliminate them. There are some exceptions, though, which have to do with fortifications of various kinds. There's 2 kinds of fortifications. Regular forts, which look like this, and they double the strength of the enemy units, and they prevent any overruns from happening. And then there's entrenchments, which... there we got one. There's one in Boston, but I didn't want to dig through that. What entrenchments do is they just put a -1 on the die roll for the combat. You still use you don't use the tactical cards when you're fighting against a fortification. When you're fighting against an entrenchment, you do still use the tactical cards because your forces will still have some mobility, so you can actually, pursue out of the entrenchment and get a potential bonus. As long as you're the defender, and the defender is not necessarily the person who didn't move. Either side can attack in a given hex. If the person who moved chooses not to attack, the person who didn't move can come out and attack. The entrenchments only help you if you're on the defensive. Same with fortifications. You come out of them to attack. There's some modifications here. Well, let's talk about artillery first. So if you're involved in a battle against entrenchments or fortifications, artillery counters are each a plus or -1. These are big, heavy siege artillery. They're slow moving. One of the... I don't know if it makes it into the 3rd edition, but I think it does. But a lot of people complained about how slow they are. But these aren't meant to be field artillery here. They're only meant to actually operate in siege situations. They wouldn't be effective in any other circumstance. So, that's why they're so slow and why they only affect you in the fortifications. Some special rules because of special units like militia. If militia are involved in combat by themselves against regulars, they get a penalty to the die roll. When Indians are involved in combat without British regulars, they also get a penalty, even if they're facing militia. The kind of non-combat stuff, forts, not entrenchments, but forts, supplies, magazines, and artillery, these can all be captured. Most of them can be destroyed without any real difficult problem. Fortifications require that you actually dismantle them, which is a more complex rule, which I can't remember. Tells you how to use and understand the scenario cards, which isn't too complicated. All right, let's take a pause since I have to generate a new video anyhow. You know, I can't just load this up in one chunk because I already paused once. Okay, inverted and decoy counters. Certain units, Continental Army, the militias, including militia dragoons, and I think Indians, yeah, are able to operate in a flipped over state. You know, that way you don't know what you're facing. And to make things further confusing, players have decoy counters, which they can put on the board and move around out of forces that are flipped over, so that they can really kind of disguise what's going on. I am going to play with that. You might say, well, why? You're playing solo. Yeah, I find that using such things actually helps. There's one problem with it in this game. This is your standard Avalon Hill old style game. All the counters have the same back. Now, you want all the same side to have the same back if you're doing this, but it is going to be kind of difficult to tell, hey, is that a rebellion stack or is that a Tory militia stack? I can't tell. That's some place where playing solo will actually help. Plus, you know, it's kind of cool because honestly, you might lose your own pieces that way, but I would actually suggest or consider, if you're playing this opposed and you want to play with this optional rule, coloring the backs of your counters in a manner that, you know, is cleanly done, but that you can actually distinguish that, or just put a dot on each one or something, just to help you realize who's who. And I may end up taking that step. I'm not really thrilled with it because I would be doing it ad hoc and probably not doing a great job with it. Okay, bateau. So essentially these guys, and this is something you see later on in a few systems that use hex side rivers along the hex side. Avalon Hill doesn't tend to do that, but later in Victory Games Civil War you have this. These guys move along the hex sides, and they have 15 movement points and can move along them. Now, 15 movement points of hex side movement is like 7 or 8 movement. It's about the same as your movement rate that your infantry have. So they're not terribly useful in most areas of the board, but there are certain areas where there's a lot of mountains and stuff where the easiest and only reasonable way to move is using these. I'm trying to remember how you build them. You can capture enemy ones as long as there's no one next to them, basically. But actually building them may not be here. It may be over in the campaign rules. But yeah, that's basically how they work. And they can only move along the rivers and lakes, along the hex sides. They have to disembark whatever units are on board them. And then they can also be used to reduce the movement effect costs of various rivers. And I think they basically reduce it by 1. Class 3 rivers are down to 1 movement point as well. And they're normally prohibited. So they act as kind of a ferry sailing across the river and shuttling the troops across. And the smaller rivers, you just lash a few of them together and you can walk right across, right? Force marches. Force marches are dangerous in this game. You can only do it with combat type units, which means you're not going to be force marching your artillery to try to get it into battle quickly, you know, with the rest of the units. You state which units are force marching. Now these rules, I have some real iffy questions about the force march, and I probably will tinker with them. I haven't looked to see how other people handle them is basically what happens. But you claim how many movement points you want to move, you roll a die, and you get, well no, this is going to work. You get a number of movement points. And you must use them all. And that's what's tough here. So if you end up in a situation where you're kind of hemmed in a funny place due to terrain movement costs or whatever, and you can't exactly use your movement points, the penalty is you lose the entire stack. Otherwise, you may or may not get movement points, and you may or may not lose half your stack. Okay. The campaign game. And that's what we're going to be playing. The other rules are sufficient for playing any of these suckers, but we keep going. And there are going to be options that you could actually use. Well, we had some of them, the decoy counters, the force march. Yeah, this was all optional. Okay, the campaign simulation game. So the first year of the game, the Brits have pre-recorded reinforcements, and those are going to be for their British regulars. Starting in 77, the Brits are going to get 2 British regulars each quarter. We have quarterly interphases in each turn, or each between the turns. They get 2 regulars at New York City if they own it. And owning it means having troops there within a certain quantity. At the beginning of the winter, they get 1 in Charleston if they have it under control, 1 in Philadelphia if they have it under control. And at the beginning of every spring, summer, and fall quarter, they get 2 supply at one of these listed ports that they control. And these are all actually spelled out on there for whatever that's worth. What is MVC? Minimum victory conditions. Okay. The Americans, starting in April, the first interface here, will start getting their CA strength points in each of the 4 strategic areas. And that's going to be tracked with these. How many different replacements you're going to get of each type. Now, how is that determined? There's this chart here, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. At the beginning of each spring quarter, they also get a supply unit in each of the areas, and there are 4 areas in the game represented by these 4 boxes. The Deep South, which ends here, South Central in between, Middle States running up the middle, and then New England over here. Canada is outside the scope of both of these, even though the line kind of makes it look like it's part of the Middle States. Canada is sort of somewhere between New England and the Middle States, and we'll see what that means. It basically means the militia in Canada count against those 2, if I recall correctly. Maybe it is just Middle States. I'm not sure. Okay. And then they get a supply in each summer quarter in each area where no strategic towns are controlled by the British, which generally it's hard for the British to control an entire area, but usually they can control a strategic town if they want to in any given area. It's just a matter of how much they want to spread their force out for that. The British are the only ones who can control areas. The core rules say you control an area, you control a strategic town if you have a British regular in it. That gets changed a little later, so we're going to be looking at the change there. You're going to require more Brits to control certain cities. And then they kind of spell things out in a little too much detail for my taste, but it indicates that you have to actually have the fort if there is one there, is basically what it says. Okay, if you control all strategic towns in an area, then you control the entire area, which affects some of these things. Now, what was not discussed here, but I think is implied, is that, and maybe it's actually specifically covered here, that the militia are also going to be based on these charts, and you get them during the interphase too, or lose them. Now, the way this is worked out is you have a rate for each type based on the area, and the area, this is kind of weird. So if there's no British strength points in the area, the Continental Army grows to its maximum for the turn. It gets that maximum number of replacement points. The rebel militia are at their minimum And what that means is if there's too many rebel militia in that area, the rebellion player has to remove some. And if they're below, they get to add more. And Tory militia are at their maximum. Now, if there's British strength points in the area but no strategic towns controlled, this changes where the rebel militia grow and the Tory militia become weaker. The idea here is that the British Army had an interesting effect, even on the Tory militia. Unlike the effect they have in, say, some of the Vietnam games, most especially the Victory Games one, but most of them, the military didn't tend to have a fully positive effect on the impression of the populace. So British control of an area often inflamed the populace more. While they did provide certain protection and they could prevent the Continental Army from growing, the various militia groups tended to take on the people predisposed towards rebellion. And the Tories tended to become more suppressed. They were not treated well within the military. So the further away the military was, the more likely the Tories were to actually be able to operate. They were being, commandeered essentially into tasks that they were unhappy with. And so they were less available for the most part as replacement, as auxiliaries for the British Army. And that's kind of what's reflected in here. So if the British have strength points in the area and all strategic towns are controlled, you get no Continental Army, you get a minimum number of rebel militia, and it's worse than that because you can't actually build any without a strategic town, so you won't grow up to the minimum. So this is actually how you can totally destroy the colonial support. But the Tory militia is also at a minimum. Hey, they feel safe. They don't feel like they have to really do a lot. And they don't feel any particular inclination to helping out the military because they're being treated badly by it. And then you're told where you can place your units, and essentially it's in the strategic towns. There may be some more. The Americans play first, and then the Brits. And the British units, let me see. The Tory militia are in British-controlled strategic towns. If there are no British-controlled strategic towns, then they're placed in non-enemy occupied strategic town hexes. If there aren't any of those, then they can be placed nearby, out in the suburbs, Okay, so how do you win the campaign game? What are you trying to do? Well, the Brits want to control 20 strategic towns for one complete turn after the turn in which they take their 20th. And this has to be done, the end of December 1780. There's not a by or before or after or anything like that, which leads me to a little bit of confusion. Those towns must include Boston, Newport, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, and Savannah. The Americans, so that's how the British win. And I assume 1780 means, it's got to be by, I don't know. I'm not sure. The Americans win by achieving the following British minimum, the American player wins if he can prevent the British player from achieving the following British minimum victory conditions. In 1777, if the Brits don't control 10 strategic towns, or all strategic towns in one area, they lose, period. And in 1779, it's 10 strategic towns, which include all the strategic towns in an area. Or they lose, which enforces something like the Southern strategy where you consolidate the British forces down in one area, because you actually need both those requirements. So the British player has to get to his 20 before the game ends. The American has to bust one of the two British minimum victory conditions, or avoid the British from winning and play out the full game. All right, so we're gonna hit the building bateau, but I'll put this here and take a little pause. Okay, we have 3 Indian tribal units in this game, and the American player can't move into those until the British moves the Indians out of them. And the Indian units have no ability to replace. That'll change when we look at the leader optional rules. Those add some fixes to the game. Here we get to the building bateau, which is apparently only in the campaign game. You can invert a supply or magazine in a hex and build an inverted bateau in that hex. And they uninvert, I think, in the next turn. You could also exchange a supply unit for 3 bateau. Or you could break a magazine into 2 supply units and get 3 bateau off of one of them. You can't break them both down for whatever reason, although if you had 2 supply units there to begin with, you could build 6, I think. During the winter, there's some special restrictions, and the winter is going to run from January through March. This is New England in general. It affects those units in the Middle States, New England, and Canada. So it's going to be, Pennsylvania and up, which is, pretty nasty weather in the winter, I guess, compared to the South. You can't make attacks if you don't have supply. Supply units can only support 2 combats per phase, and if they do so, they're destroyed. There's no overruns. There are some movement restrictions. All units have their movement allowance halved north of the Central South. Bateau and transport fleet counters cannot move or transport units on really any river or lake hex sides. Transport counters, however, can move from the ports to sea lanes, and you can't force march in those areas. The Continental Army is going to suffer a winter reduction. Now, I don't have that. There's 2 versions of this. Essentially, the core version here, and we'll see if the other one goes with it. If the British control no strategic towns in an area, the Continental Army forces in that area lose a quarter of their strength. As a whole, you don't count each stack individually. If the British control at least a strategic town, they lose half their strength. And if they control all the strategic towns, the Continentals lose 3/4 of their strength. And they always lose 3/4 in Canada, even if they have all of Canada. French intervention. Okay, this gets complicated, but essentially you're going to roll a die roll on each turn to see if the French intervened. Like I said, it doesn't bother with that major victory concept. And again, maybe the 3rd edition has baked in some additional rules to that. This is actually an incredibly detailed section because it handles all the naval movement. I'm going to need to take a pause. Let's see what I can come through with in terms of the French. So they come in with 2 battle fleets and then this possible variable fleet. And the 2 fleets can come in on any, basically, they come in on these sea channels. There may be specific restrictions. But they're going to be moving onto the board from these spaces. And these allow you to make 1-turn movements to key locations. So the West Indies is here. I'm going to kind of gloss over these as I usually do with naval rules because, first of all, I don't have all the details in my head. And secondly, we're a long way from getting to them. So the actual ships have quite a bit of movement allowance for on map, and they can 40 hexes sounds like a whole lot. I don't know. It's probably about half the board that they can skim in a turn. It does cost them points to do things, though, that are more expensive. So, let's see. Naval movement. I'm trying to see what the cost of it is. If it has... Jeez. I don't know where it's specified. I'd think it would be somewhere, but... You know, these are old games, and so as of right now, I'm assuming it's 1 point per hex. I'm not gonna look it up. Yeah, 1 point for every sea lane hex. However, you know, they specify that, so they probably specify all the others somewhere else. They can move along rivers. I think they move along river hex sides just like the bateau do, and it's 1 movement point per. Okay, good enough. But they can't go up into the smallest of the rivers, these little trickles, which the bateau can... Bateau, there I go with my bad twat again. They can land at ports and drop units off, and it costs the units some movement points when they're dropped off in different locations. I think the ports allow them to keep moving, but some of the others do not. Like if they make a naval invasion against an enemy port, they can't run away out of there, for example, which makes sense. We have places where the French can grab supply if they stop, if they move to those, and then they can haul supplies back in case they need those. Special rules involving Halifax and the St. Lawrence River, all kinds of minutiae in here that honestly, it's just not the kind of stuff that I really want to deal with in too much detail. I think I can kind of guess at what it says. You know, Halifax is here, it's all pro-British. It allows me down here if I want. You know, I think that's pretty much what it all says, but it says it very deeply. Or it says it in a lot of little singular cases. The rules usually don't bother me this much. I don't know if it's just because they're naval or if they're far more ineffective towards reaching me the way they're written. Yeah, here you have the debarkation costs. And naval units will fight on a differential chart rather than an odds chart over on this side. And you've got results here, so ships get damaged, and that means they have to go back away. They retreat off the map, basically. Or they can even get sunk if you have a large differential. And I think that's it. Okay. Now the additional rules. The Continental Navy starts the game. I don't think the game starts in January. It does it? I guess it does. The Continental Navy is going to appear in a controlled port in the American segment of February 1776. So I got to pull. I should have a fleet here. There we go. And as you can see, it has a 0 strength. The transports also have a 0 strength. They can't attack. In general, the transports will be wiped out by a regular fleet hitting them. The Continental Navy has the capacity to attack the transports, and that's pretty much all it can do. I don't think it can transport any units or anything like that. The rules on militia dragoons. Dragoons are a little faster than regular militia. The base rules to the game say you trade 2 for 1 in. Like you can get rid of 2 of your militia and you can get a dragoon. Well, you're not talking about a big difference in movement allowance, and the guy who made the leaders rules says that people generally don't build dragoons, and that's completely ahistorical because dragoons were there. So he's come up with his own rules, which we'll touch a little later. The inverted and decoy counters are used the same as before, except, except nothing. The same types of units can be decoys. Okay, so here comes some weird things that I want to deal with, but these are a little more detailed. Variable transport costs. So normally you can put a certain number of units on board a ship. I don't know what that number is. It may be this 15 and 3 here that they can carry. And that's just anything costs 1. Well, they changed that. So now infantry costs 1, but other things have higher costs, except for supply, which still costs 1. Another thing they changed is some of the towns, the strategic towns, are larger and more difficult to control than others. So in order to rate that, so Boston requires 4 British regulars, Newport takes 3, New York City takes 6, Philadelphia 4, Charleston 2, everything else is 1. This one is variable Army winter reduction rates. So instead of the old set, which I believe went this 25, 50, 75, 75 to 1777. Each year has its own ratio. How fair is that? It's kind of like the French roll, to tell you the truth. It may include how harsh the winter was, and it may include some other factors as to, like, how well the war was going overall, which is why I say it's kind of like the French roll. Is, you're just expected to get these values without worrying about, any kind of political situation. So from that standpoint, there's very little in terms of the political rules in this game. There essentially are none. But manipulating these charts in terms of what troops you're going to get, the area control, that's really the only way that it's actually handled here. Okay, what about leaders? Let's take another little break. Sum up the leader rules, which, again, look fairly detailed, but there really isn't all that much in them. Well, some of it's more than the leaders itself. So the leaders are ranked for a number of things. First of all, they have a rank, which is going to affect how many troops they can command and also what their seniority is. But beyond their seniority, beyond their rank, is a seniority within that rank. And the lower that number, unless it's 0, in which case it should be treated more like infinite. My zoom's not working there. The lower the number, the higher the rank, essentially. So Washington here is 2 stars with a rank 1. 2 stars is the largest any commander is. So the leaders affect movement, or more specifically, without the leaders, your movement is affected. You're not allowed any forced marches unless you have a leader. Anything other than dragoons or Indians moving has to pay twice as much unless it has a leader. A leader that's with dragoons has additional movement points. Somebody gives them a horse or something. And then there's a further clarification that units only get one unit of movement no matter what. Leaders can move and channel multiple troops at once, which kind of doesn't make a lot of sense since the turn is supposedly a fixed length or something, but whatever. Now, for the leaders to control troops, it has to, it's based on the leadership rank. This isn't terribly well handled. Okay, so the different generals are ranked differently by nationality. I'm trying to see where it is. Okay. So a 2-star British general can lead 8 SP. A 1-star one can lead 4. The American 2-star generals can only lead 6, except for Washington, who can lead 8. And the 1-star generals can lead 3. The French leaders are like Brits. Whenever you win an important battle, which is either capturing a major city where there were at least 5 strength points, or completely destroying, and this is really what the major battle should be defined as, an enemy force in battle that has more infantry, that has 10 or more infantry strength points. In either of those cases, the winning commanding officer gets a +1 value. Now that +1 value can't accumulate. You can only be 1 away from your base value for a leader. So Washington can go up to a 2 combat ability. It's the middle number. The other numbers, well, are less important really, but they're not. They have other values. And it is possible if you end up losing such a major battle, you'll get a -1 to your value. Now, there's a good chance you get killed if you lose that major battle, though, so that will probably be less often. I considered putting a secondary value on the back of the counters. The danger to that, of course, is the leaders can't be decoyed then if I do that. I've already got one problem of that nature, though. With Benedict Arnold, I've made him a flippable leader instead of replacing, which was probably a bit of a mistake. A lot of the leaders have special rules, and rather than try to wade through this for them, I've got them here. This is actually includes some leaders that are not in the game. These partisans like Marion, these come from the 3rd edition rules. As far as I can tell, that's the only place that I've been able to find them. And the 3rd edition is really a fan-based edition as far as I can tell. But like Washington, who is particularly special, if he's in a hex with a Continental Army, he's allowed to break off after the first 2 rounds of combat without having to play a withdrawal card or anything. That's pretty potent. He's got a bigger command radius, and he always can command Franco-American forces. There's a penalty for commanding a mixed force, unless you're one of a few set of leaders. I think the French can command the Americans fine. I don't know. Anyway, when you fight in a battle, there's a chance that you get injured or die, and it's on an 11 or 12. 12 kills you, 11 knocks you out for a die roll worth of turns. Except if you're captured, if your force is completely destroyed, in which case there's a good chance that you're captured instead, or killed. You only roll 1 die, and a 5 or 6 are your loss values. If you end up with less than 10 leaders for the British or 8 for the Americans, new leaders become available. And these will be nameless 0-point leaders. There's a certain number of them already on the board. I might have to make new counters. I can just use blank counters and, say that's a leader or whatever. I don't have to write them up, I guess. He also wanted to make Indians come back. The reason for this is usually when you play this game, I guess, and I've seen this actually, the Americans go off, they kill all the Indians, and then there's never a threat there again. And the reality of the situation was there were harassment raids all throughout the war. There was no way of just knocking them out in this same way. And in order to take care of that, the Indians come back, I think, 1 per year, which means there'll be some threat from them throughout. Another change was Dragoons. I mentioned this already. I think 1 unit, the first Dragoon in each area only counts as 1 strength factor. So you can actually build a new Dragoon each turn, and thereby they actually can become a fairly potent force without having to spend 2 of your militia each turn to have Dragoons. Okay. This is a change that I either misread the rule wrong, or much less likely the guy who wrote this read it wrong, which is that the French variable fleet can keep coming in with more and more troops. That's not how I read it. I read it what he's rewritten, which is they come in once. There's a random events here, which is he's suggesting that you roll once just prior to the spring and fall interfaces for each player. You know what? I may try to do this, but that is something that's very likely that I'll forget it because there's no notification on the thing. And so what? Less random events, less effect on those special rules. I don't think that's a big deal. I know third edition has a more detailed random event system built into it. In the long run, probably that's what I would move to if I like the core of this enough. So far, I haven't been thrilled enough with the core of this game to really want to expand it too much. But, maybe the core changes with those rules. It looks like most of it does not, though. I'm looking forward to the end of Empire. I want to take a look at that. Someday, I would love to see the SPI American Revolution game. It's an area-based game. It looks kind of like my Rand. What the hell is it? The Great War. But in terms of the way the map is designed, etc., probably the same influence was on those two maps. One either the same artist was involved in both, or perhaps there was some taking on that style of map by one side or another. SPI probably predated whatever Rand did. Rand isn't the Rand Corporation. It is. There have been some supposed links to it, but it looks pretty shady to me. It really looks like just people who have taken the Rand name and run with it for their own war games, although some people claim otherwise, so I don't. It's just whenever I investigate those claims, they seem incorrect. But you know what? I don't have a whole hell of a lot of hope for either of those, nor another game that I've played, which is 13, The Colonies in Revolt, a Richard Berg treatment of the American Revolution, which I feel is different from this, but has about the same effect on me in terms of really making me feel like I'm seeing the American Revolution in an enjoyable way. Honestly, I do not think I've seen a strategic game that I'm really thrilled with about the Revolution. I've already reviewed and talked about Washington's War. I think it's a kind of cool game as a CDG, but I think it fails as a simulation of the war. This may work better as a simulation, but it's not a fun enough game. Maybe my issue with it. I certainly have never really walked away from it feeling like, I want to play that again, or wow, that was really cool, And I've walked away with that feeling with most of the games that I liked. This I got fairly early in my gaming career, as you were. So, it's not like, well, I'll tell you, there's another game that disappointed in a similar way, which is Freddy the Great, which is also seen as a complete classic. That has leaders in it about as flavorless as the leaders that have been added in the patch to this. It's just, I want something more, and I'm not sure what that more is. Maybe it's going to be the coin game, although I haven't even pre-ordered that. All right, let's, I have some real questions about four-sided capturing the feel of the war for me at all. So that kind of sets aside. I just don't feel like the definitive treatment's been made, and we'll see, because a lot of people think this is it, and maybe this has suppressed other designs from really coming out for the most part, and then we the people in Washington's War, of course, prevented anybody from doing a different card-driven design on it, because how do you run up against the first card-driven game with another design of that type without it almost being an insult? I don't know. I think there's room for it, and I know Mark Herman is man enough that he would be willing to, he would not hold any harsh feelings towards somebody who did a very different sort of design, but using card driven or some other, or certainly some other mechanism. I just don't feel that that game actually captures the aspects of the war that I'm most interested in. The go-like behavior doesn't work for me. But we'll see about this, because this actually promises a lot with these. It just doesn't, it's never delivered for me. Okay.